Hi, I'm David Spears on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Now, we're recording this on Thursday morning, and just an hour or so ago, the New South Wales Labor government announced that Australia's largest coal-fired power plant will have its life extended by a further 2 years. It's no great surprise. Premier Chris Minns had been flagging this for some time. Nonetheless, it's a pivotal moment. What's going wrong in the shift to renewables that requires taxpayers to underwrite the extension by 2 years of the Eraring power station to keep the lights on? Are some of our best laid plans in this shift to renewables being mugged by reality? And should we now expect more similar moves to extend the life of coal-fired power plants? This move comes as the coalition federally inches closer to unveiling its nuclear power plans. This week we saw the CSIRO weigh in with their verdict on what nuclear would cost, and it certainly isn't cheap. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is also today announcing funding, about $500 million, to incentivise battery making in Australia. So to help make sense of where we're at in this great energy transition, I'm very pleased to be joined by energy market guru Tony Wood from the Grattan Institute. Tony Wood, thanks so much for joining us. Good to talk to you. Let's start with the Eraring extension. The New South Wales government, as I mentioned, they've struck a deal with Origin Energy to keep the plant running for an extra 2 years. It's going to cost taxpayers up to $225 million a year for each of those 2 years to underwrite the company's losses or share any profit, should there be a profit. What do you make of this deal?
Well, for the reasons you almost touched upon in the introduction, David, that things have not been going according to Plan A. And when that happens and there's a lot of uncertainty developing, electricity is actually very important that we have a reliable supply. And so this is all about taking out insurance. We don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of years. Things are moving okay, but they're moving far too slowly. The closure of Eraring, which was scheduled for next year, was perceived by and analysed by the market operator to say, if we do this, we could start to run into problems, risks to reliability, but they didn't have a solution. They were just obviously flagging this was a problem. And they've been saying that for the last couple of years, but it's getting worse.
So where is that problem, though? Is it the transmission lines are taking too long, particularly those big interconnectors between New South Wales and South Australia? Or is it the volume of renewables, the solar and wind farms, or is it a mixture?
Well, it's both, because up until now, most of our new solar and wind farms were put where we had capacity on the transmission to deal with them. We didn't have to build any more. And also we put it on our household rooftops as well. So that worked pretty well. But we've pretty well exhausted that. And so as we've planned for building more renewables, most of it's not where the transmission lines are today. So to get the renewables built at the scale that's necessary to transition towards low emissions and also to replace coal means we've got to build more transmission to support those renewables. And it's that combination which has proved to be so difficult and so expensive and taking so long.
So this is pretty contentious. Do you reckon this is the right move, though, to extend Eraring for 2 years?
Look, I think it is. I mean, if I live to 150, I'll say, bugger, I spent too much money on life insurance. I don't think that's going to happen. So look, I think that's what this is about, right? I mean, there are unknowns. And to be fair, the way this is set up, two important things about it. A, it's transparent. At least we know what the government is committed to and what Origin's committed to. That's very important. Secondly, it's actually sort of, whether it's symmetrical risk management or not is unclear, but it's quite possible that the government doesn't end up paying out the $225 million that you've talked about, because the arrangement is Origin has committed to keep the plant open for another 2 years. Next, what happens is if they choose to enter into an option with trigger an option with the government, then that profit loss sharing arrangements comes into play. Now, that may not even be necessary. So I think this is probably as good as it gets in terms of managing that very difficult risk.
If the government's going to do this is probably the way to do it in terms of the way they're structuring the underwriting the losses, if there are losses, sharing in the profits if there's a profit. Does it mean we're likely to see more of this with other coal-fired plants that are scheduled to close?
Well, you can imagine the owners of other coal-fired plants saying, I'll have what they're having, thank you very much. Look, in Victoria, we've already seen, and we don't know what the details are, and I've been critical of that, where the Victorian government entered into similar sorts, in principle, risk-sharing arrangements with the owners of two of the large coal-fired power stations there.
That was kept confidential, wasn't it?
It was kept confidential. And I think that was very bad because these guys are competing in a market. And if you're competing with them, you should know what special deals, if any, they've got with governments that you've got to compete with. That's why I think that was bad. This is much better. We may see other things because there are other coal-fired power stations scheduled to close over the next 10 years in Victoria and New South Wales and, of course, in Queensland. Queensland's a bit different because Queensland owns most of its own generators and it can do its own deal between different arms of government.
Yeah, but you reckon in New South Wales and Victoria, this might be the template. We might see more coal-fired power staying open for longer with these sort of arrangements.
Well, it's more about making sure that they don't close too early and don't also close too late. And managing this, getting the Goldilocks point right is going to be enormously tricky. Therefore, it's always going to be preferable to pay a little bit more to get a bit more than to pay a bit less, because when the lights go out is not where you want to be.
Now, Eraring's the nation's biggest coal-fired power station. If this is going to run for 2 more years, maybe others strike similar deals. Does that, do you think, lower the appetite for renewable investments? Will those looking at investing in wind and solar hit the brakes?
In some ways, it's almost the other way around. That if we've now got, when people aren't too sure what's going to happen, that means the risks look higher, and that means either people hesitate or they invest in things that are much more risk averse and therefore more expensive. I think if this combined with what the New South Wales government is already doing to roll out the renewable energy zones, and I expect we'll see more of that later this week, the combination of those two things ideally starts to line things up so that you do get the renewables being built. They've got a lot of catching up to do, as we've said. The renewables get built, and as they are built, we can see with confidence that, okay, now we can close our own. Because remember, Liddell closed and it went just fine. Fortunately then, we didn't need to build all this other stuff, which has proven to be, it was very much underestimated how difficult it will be. Now we know.
So, ironically, this might create the certainty, you reckon, for renewable investments to go ahead?
I hesitate to use the word certainty, but I would use the word more predictability, put it that way.
Okay. What about the impact this might have on our target, 2030 target for 43% lower emissions and 82% renewables by 2030? That's coming up pretty soon. How does this play into those targets?
Well, that together with those other things we mentioned, including the federal government's commitment to underwrite itself more investment in renewable energy and storage, are all trying to address those targets. I think the 43% overall emissions reduction target, which is legislated, is looking close to being okay, partly because of the renewables which have been growing, but also because of the deal they've done on the very large industrial emitters, the safeguard mechanism it's called. On the other hand, the 82% renewable, I think, still looks very challenging indeed. I think it was, in my view, an unfortunate commitment to make, because we might get to 70% renewable by 2030. That would be an amazing result for a country like Australia and would be a standout in the world, really. But we'll feel a bit bad about it, at least the government will. They'll be made to feel bad about it if they undershoot their 82%.
But does running Eraring for 2 more years make that even less likely?
No, I don't think so. I think the combinations of Eraring with the renewables being built was going to pretty well help us get there. And that's the whole point here. I mean, when you talk about keeping coal open longer, it sounds as though you're anti-climate change. In fact, it's fundamentally important to manage the role of coal and gas in this transition, because you've got to maintain a reliable system while we get to low emissions, because no one's going to forgive governments if they stuff that up.
That's really interesting. Look, somewhat related to this, earlier in the week, we saw the energy market operator, AEMO, warn of an increased risk of blackouts this coming summer in New South Wales and Victoria. Why are they issuing that warning?
Well, partly is related to the things we've already been talking about. And this is consistent. We published a report only less than a month ago that warned of the same sorts of things. Not to say now's the time for turning. I mean, this is a transition we're going to do. It's going to happen to us anyway. We have to do it as well as we can. And the risk has been that we've seen the big interconnector between New South Wales and South Australia being pushed back a year. And we've seen the renewables in New South Wales being pushed back a year. The good news is, sort of, we're seeing snowy hydro maybe a year earlier than people were worried about. So all those things are moving all over the place. And AEMO put out their report, an update to their statement of opportunities, it's called, to say, look, we still think there's some problems here. There's a whole lot of things, and there's a lot of them, and we mentioned some of them, which need to be done. If they are done, we should be fine. but this is not going to be. There's some rocky areas ahead, and there's some risks here because if we had really bad weather, particularly winter's looking pretty more challenging than summer actually. That could be tricky. But right now, I think they're saying, we look as though we're okay, but a lot of this isn't forecasting with certainty. This is basically saying there are risks ahead. Now's the time to be managing those risks. And AEMO said they will now step into the market and ensure that they've also taken out insurance against having some reserves available just in case. Not that they'll need them, but just in case they do.
Sounds like economic forecasts a little bit. Look, I want to get your thoughts on nuclear because while we're waiting for the coalition to announce their policy for nuclear power plants, the CSIRO and AEMO released their latest Gen Cost report during the week. This one, for the first time, looks at large-scale nuclear and stacks it up against everything else. And lo and behold, it reckons large-scale nuclear, yes, cheaper than small-scale, small modular reactors, but still would cost twice as much for your household bill as renewables, even when you do factor in the transmission lines and the firming with batteries and pumped hydro and so on. Are these credible numbers in this Gen Cost report?
I think for Australia, they're as credible as you're going to get in 2024 because we don't have a nuclear industry in this country. It's actually illegal to make electricity from nuclear in this country. So what they've had to do is to mess with what would it cost to actually start from scratch and build 1, 2, 3, half a dozen nuclear power stations, maybe where the old coal-fired power stations we've been talking about are now today, and what would that cost? And getting someone to quote on that is very, very difficult because you can look at other countries who've been doing nuclear for years, countries which are often heavily subsidised by their own governments, and the numbers are very difficult to get a handle on. So I think this is as good a numbers as you're going to get at the moment, and they're saying it would be very expensive, and not just expensive, it will take a long time. If we started today, you might get your first plant on the ground in 15 years' time. Now, in 15 years' time, most of those coal-fired power stations we're talking about will be well and truly in the grave. So that creates a very difficult problem, I think, for the opposition to put this forward as a clear, credible policy of a way forward for Australia.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big question about what they're going to do to fill that void before these nuclear plants are up and running. But a couple of things. They take issue with some of the numbers in the report. One in particular is just, I'm keen for your thoughts on utilisation. Now, the CSR report, I think, says that the nuclear plants would run at 66% or something utilisation. The Libs reckon they'd run a hell of a lot more than that. What do you think? I'm keen for your thoughts on this because we're going to have a lot of solar and wind in the mix in the next 10 or 15 years. How often or how heavily would we be running nuclear plants?
All these different technologies have different characteristics and none of them runs 100% of the time. In most markets around the place, and this is the basis of the CSIRO numbers, large facilities like this, coal plants, nuclear plants, tend to run maybe anywhere between 50 and 80% of the time. Now, we have seen circumstances in Australia where some of our very low-cost brown coal-fired power stations in Victoria have achieved more than that, 80, even 90% of the time. It's not a guess, but it's a very tricky estimate. And I think what should be done, I would certainly say this, is that, okay, let's assume that 53% I think is the number they're using. That sounds pretty low to many people, but okay, let's assume what would happen to the cost, which looks pretty high at that level, if it was 60 or 70% capacity factor. Obviously, if you've got a very capital-intensive investment and you don't utilise it, the less you utilise it, the more it costs per unit of power you produce when you do utilise it. So clearly it makes a big difference.
It's what we're seeing with coal, right?
Exactly right. And that's where coal has got into trouble when it doesn't run all that much. It really becomes very expensive to run and so forth. And gas is the same. They're all the same in that sense. And on wind and solar, wind and solar run anywhere between 20% and 40% at best of the time. But of course, you then have to do things to balance that. The important thing here is what's the total system cost if we start putting in nuclear. That's what I think is important. But these input numbers, which are the cost of an individual plant, feed into that sort of calculation.
And just on the locations, the coalition, as you point out, keeps saying they're looking at the old coal-fired sites where those generators shut down. You stick in a nuclear because you'd be able to plug it in a lot more easily than running transmission lines to renewables everywhere. Does that make sense? If you're going to do it, that's where you'd put them?
Look, the advantage of that is that, we talked a minute ago about the difficulties of building all the transmission to support the renewables. If you did put the nuclear power stations where the coal ones have been, you've got the transmission in place, broadly speaking. So we may very well avoid a lot of that investment in transmission. Now, not all of it, because I don't think the government's talking about basically moving away from renewables. The really interesting question is, how do you, if nuclear is basically more like what's called baseload power, it's hardly a backup for wind and solar. So what sort of system do you have when you've got high levels of wind and solar and you've built a lot of the transmission anyway? I don't think anyone's going to suddenly stop building the transmission we're building today. And I think you wouldn't avoid all of that transmission. Maybe you'd avoid some of it.
If the nuclear plants are still 15 years away.
Absolutely. That's why if we'd started 40 years ago, maybe we wouldn't be talking about this, right? But
so it doesn't sound, Tony, like you're all that keen on nuclear anytime soon, but over time, is it something that still should be on the table?
I wouldn't rule it out. That's my position. I think that personally, I think having a ban on nuclear is an unnecessary irritant. I think we should, in my view, we should remove the ban. Now, if we did, I understand that's politically tricky for the government because of what would happen with the environmentalists and the Greens. However, if we did, no one's going to build a nuclear power station tomorrow. The really interesting question is, and even in the numbers put out by GenCost or CSIRO yesterday, they only really went assuming that when they did all that extra build out you talked about before to support renewables, in a high renewables world, you'd get to 70 or 80 or 90% renewable. They didn't talk about the last 10%. That will become a bigger issue in the next decade. And so it's possible, for example, that hydrogen power stations, gas with offsets, more deep storage, new battery technologies that don't even exist today, they could all emerge as the solution. But if they don't, and if at the same time the world does develop cost-effective small modular reactors, then of course we should think about it. I've got nothing against nuclear. It's the economics that worry me. I'm not so worried about the other, scary things about the radioactive processes. I think it's basically an economic question, and Australia should be keeping a very close eye on what's happening internationally. As you know, there's not a lot. It's proving to be very difficult with small modular reactors, but we'll see.
Yeah, a nuanced position on the energy debate, Tony. What a rare thing in this debate at the moment. Look, I just want to get your thoughts on a couple of other things. Gas, we've had a lot of talk about gas lately. Government's got its future gas strategy. Do you think we need to tap more gas, open new fields in Australia?
Australia is a really simple piece of information you probably didn't know before. Australia is a really big country with a small population relatively. And the problem we've run into is the gas, where we've got a lot of gas is not where we've got a lot of people. And so up until recently, and for the last 50 years or so, Victoria has been the centre of a lot of gas activity. Most households in Victoria use gas for heating, cooking and hot water, courtesy of the gas which was developed by BHP and Exxon back in the 70s. And that gas has been a friend for us for a long, long time. Now, it's running out. People have tried to find more gas. There's not much more there. Not much has been found. So Victoria's running out of gas. But at the same time, Victoria, ahead of the other states, has said, and we need to get off gas. It's a bit like the story about, do you keep the coal-fired power stations running while you get the renewables up and running? As we move away from gas, we've got to make sure that we don't run out of gas. And that's a very tricky thing. And so all the gas we've got tends to be in places like Queensland, the Northern Territory or Western Australia. Getting that gas to Victoria in the next 5 to 10 years is a big challenge because no one's going to build new gas pipelines, I don't think, because they might not be used in the next 10 years. So import terminals, other ways of doing it. I mean, basically both sides of politics have said no to onshore development of coal seam gas in Victoria. So there is no simple solution to that. But at the same time, Australia can, for me, here's the bottom line. We're committed to net zero by 2050. What I've not seen in the strategy, and maybe the government has these numbers and I couldn't find them, is to say, if we do continue to have gas for certain roles, like, for example, backing up wind and solar, like, for example, for a while yet, being the feedstock for a lot of chemical processes that can't use electricity, then can we do that and also meet net zero by 2050? Because fundamentally, those two objectives are in tension. And that's what I think we have to be convinced of, because I can see a role for gas. It's not the role that many people would like, but it's a very different role. And then we also have to think about how do we partner with other countries that buy our gas so that they can also eventually meet their own emissions reduction targets.
And look, a final one, the future Made in Australia policy, as it's known. The government in the budget announced tax credits paid on delivery, if you like, for processing green hydrogen and processing critical minerals in Australia. Separate to that, you've got the $1 billion for making solar panels in Australia, and the Prime Minister today is detailing the $500 million for making batteries in Australia. A lot of economists say, look, there might be merit in processing critical minerals and producing green hydrogen, but making solar panels and batteries, plenty of other countries are getting into that game. Maybe it doesn't make sense for us. What do you think?
I'm not an economist, but I'm probably in the territory you just mentioned. And that we've looked hard at what's called industry policy. And there are some good reasons why you don't have industry policy. And if you're going to have it, you have to manage that. But there are also good reasons, given where we are in this transformation, which we've called the next industrial revolution, but to a timetable, there are things we have to do. And there are things that Australia will have, most likely, a significant competitive advantage. We have all these minerals and we have the renewable energy to process them. So that's a huge opportunity. As Ross Garnaut has said, the energy superpower story. That's where we are now. That means that making sure that if we're going to put public funding into this, it needs to go into those areas where it's to Australia's competitive advantage. And also, if we do fund something, and we mentioned production credits, it's like having a child on trainer wheels. Give them the trainer wheels for a couple of years, for 6 months. What you don't want to happen is when you take the trainer wheels away, they just fall over. These industries have to be supported, but they have to have a credible story that when the trainer wheels are taken away and the production credits run out, they will then be competitive. And that's why I have a lot of trouble with the two you mentioned, that is batteries and solar panels, because even if we were to make today solar panels in Australia, and there's one company that assembles them, all the raw materials come from where? China. So the criteria that the Treasurer has mentioned and are listed in the budget papers last week, absolutely important that they are rigorously imposed, and the decisions about what we support meets those criteria in terms of our competitive advantage, and also that they will in the long term replace the things we've got today, the sort of gas and coal exports we have. But I struggle to see how making batteries in Australia and how making solar panels in Australia would be a sensible thing to do.
Yeah, worth pointing out, Treasury itself in a supporting paper alongside the budget, was more enthusiastic about the critical minerals and hydrogen than it was about making batteries and solar panels in Australia. But the government is certainly committed to all of the above, so it will proceed along those lines. Look, there is so much going on in this energy space, Tony Wood. Great to get you making some sense of it all for us. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, David.
Now, we're keen for your thoughts on this conversation. Any suggestions you might have for the podcast as well, please rate, review, subscribe wherever you're listening to this. And if you've got an idea, shoot us an email. The email address, insiders@abc.net.au. Thanks to those who've already done so. We'll listen to your feedback and we'll be back in your feed next week. In the meantime, I'll see you Sunday morning. Bye for now.